Hey everyone! As the whitest member of the Feminist Frequency team, I wanted to start off this episode on white supremacy by saying something to my fellow white people out there. Given that many of our schools didn't exactly do the best job of teaching us about how white supremacy works and how it's woven throughout the history of our nation, a lot of us grow up with this sense of white supremacy as some kind of abstract problem, maybe even a thing of the past, and certainly not our responsibility to solve today. So let me set the tone for where we're going here by saying that challenging, rejecting, and dismantling white supremacy is absolutely on us. We're the ones who unjustly benefit from it, and ultimately, we're the ones who can and must stop participating in and perpetuating the system.
Look, this short video is not meant to be an all-encompassing look at white supremacy. We just want to illuminate its existence and some of the ways that it functions in our culture today. I mean, the truth is, Ken Burns can unleash a 20-episode PBS documentary series about white supremacy, it'll still only scratch the surface.
My darling Lucille, it pains me greatly to know that I may never again see the sun rise on the Mississippi Delta and behold your beautiful face. Yet if I must lay down my life so that our children and grandchildren can continue to be slave owners and subjugate black people, why, then I do so gladly.
Let's take a super quick crash course through the history of American white supremacy. It's not something that just naturally existed. Basically, that stuff got imported from Europe along with smallpox, pilgrim collars, and calling the police on black people barbecuing in your general vicinity. White supremacy has always been a system of assumptions, actions, and regulations that rationalize a social order in which white people are positioned at the top because they are inherently smarter, more civilized, more righteous, you name it. From the very beginnings of the American experiment, white supremacy has excused the brutal, inhumane treatment of indigenous peoples and African slaves because whiteness is believed to confer a natural authority over other, lesser peoples.
In the early American colonies, the allure of white supremacy allowed the ruling class to drive an effective wedge between poor European laborers and African slaves. Although we should be careful not to conflate the status or experience of the two groups, the fact is that both groups were exploited by a wealthy landowning population. And that ruling class was justifiably concerned about the consequences if all the people at their mercy unified to rebel against them. So they granted poor whites certain social privileges that did nothing whatsoever to address the economic injustice they were suffering, but did cement their social position as higher than that of black people. This, coupled with false rhetoric about the inherent inferiority of non-whites, the savagery of American Indians, the low intelligence of black people, distracted poor whites from their justified outrage at the ruling classes. Things may not have improved for them, but they were no longer at the bottom of the social ladder, and they could feel smugly superior to anyone without white skin. The distracting ruse of the ruling class worked like a charm.
Time and again throughout American history, white supremacy has been reasserted both as a means of keeping people of color marginalized and of keeping poor whites angry at someone other than the rich, powerful white people who are taking advantage of them. By the time Richard Nixon was running for president, explicit racism was no longer as acceptable in American politics, but conservative politicians still wanted to appeal to their racist base, so they started relying on dog whistles, terms and issues that people understood as racist rhetoric, but that they could deny were racially motivated at all.
You start out in 1954 by saying by 1968 you can't say that hurts you, backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
Under Ronald Reagan and his administration's racially motivated war on drugs, prison populations skyrocketed, and today, the U.S. has by far the highest rate of incarceration in the world, far greater than that of Russia, China, or Iran. While statistically, the selling and use of illegal drugs is similar across all racial groups, black men are imprisoned on drug charges far more regularly than white men, 20 to 50 times more regularly in some states. At this rate, fully 1 in 3 young African American men will serve time in prison in their lives. This is not the result of a race-neutral or colorblind justice system. This is not simply the result of poverty, though the widespread imprisonment of black men absolutely functions to prevent them from escaping poverty. This is the result of a system designed to maintain white supremacy as a central component of American society.
And with the openly racist Donald Trump in the White House, there isn't even a need to use coded language anymore. Like so many members of the ruling class before him, Trump knows that poor white people should be outraged at him. So he uses racist rhetoric in an attempt to make poor whites feel superior and afraid, as a way to try to keep them from seeing the truth, that they're being lied to and manipulated.
We already touched on how the current American justice system is absolutely a tool of white supremacy, and we highly recommend reading Michelle Alexander's incredible book, The New Jim Crow, to find out so much more about that. But now, we're going to talk about other ways that white supremacy manifests itself and what it means to resist it.
From Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, when disaster strikes areas with large non-white populations, the government's response is grossly insufficient to meet the needs of residents. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise way back in 1787 stipulated that black slaves were to be counted as 3/5 of a person. And it's obvious that even today, our government institutions don't view people of color as full human beings.
And so many of the people in the arenas here, were underprivileged anyway. This is working very well for them.
Yes! How nice for the poor black people whose homes have been destroyed and their communities ravaged. They get to spend some time at the Superdome.
The current estimated death toll from Hurricane Maria is over 4,600. Much of that attributed to the sheer failure on the part of the government to provide the necessary resources and support. Do you think the response to either of these crises would have been so lacking if the affected area was largely populated by white people? Spoiler alert, it wouldn't.
Like other forms of oppression, such as misogyny, white supremacy in the United States is in no way natural. It was manufactured by slaveholding plantation owners and other members of the ruling class for a very specific purpose. But to so many white people who grow up in a culture that treats it as natural and normal, it can be invisible. Yet, the manifestations of white supremacy are everywhere we look, if we can just see clearly enough to recognize them. White supremacy is a president who calls the attendees of a racist rally very fine people while condemning black athletes peacefully protesting against police violence. White supremacy is in that very police violence, as again and again and again, cops abuse and even murder black people and walk away scot-free. Darren Wilson, the police officer who murdered Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9, 2014, described the 18-year-old as a demon. This is white supremacy, which tells white people to look upon black people with fear, as something more monstrous than human. In a piece for Slate about Wilson's testimony, Jamel Bowie writes, Wilson describes Brown as the Black Brute, a stock figure of white supremacist rhetoric in the lynching era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To the white public, the Black Brute was a menacing, powerful creature who could withstand the worst punishment. That image never went away. It lingers in crack-era stories of superpowered addicts and teenage super predators, as well as rhetoric around other victims of police brutality.
Like his absurd birther campaign, which attempted to make people perceive Barack Obama as an illegitimate president, Trump's travel ban, his fear-mongering about Mexicans, his administration's crackdown on undocumented people, his caging of immigrant children as if they were animals, these are all manifestations of white supremacy. And remember, a significant part of the function of white supremacy is to distract poor whites from the economic injustice they experience, so that they're more likely to be angry at the immigrant who supposedly took their job than they are at the multimillionaire CEO who refuses to pay them a living wage. The truth is, economic injustice and white supremacy are deeply intertwined throughout American history, and we cannot really talk about economic injustice without talking about racism too.
Economic inequality in the United States is currently at unprecedented levels and is only getting worse. And vast numbers of white Americans are kept in poverty as a result of it as well. But we can only really see the issue clearly by looking at it through a lens of race. Generations of slavery, followed by generations of Jim Crow, followed by generations of the racist war on drugs have left black families in particularly poor and precarious situations. Consider that in 2016, the median wealth for black families was $17,600, while the median wealth for white families was almost 10 times that, at $171,000. This is the result of white supremacy that itself works to reinforce and perpetuate white supremacy. As whites often falsely attribute these economic differences to laziness or poor choices, and not what they actually are. the result of hiring discrimination, less access to stable, high-paying jobs, and less chance to build up wealth and pass it on to future generations.
James Baldwin wrote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. White supremacy can be changed. It can be dismantled, but first, it has to be faced. That means recognizing it as a constant of this country's history that manifests in our economy, our law enforcement, our neighborhoods, our media, our federal institutions. It requires white people to stop blindly buying into the distraction and manipulation of it all, to actively resist participation in it, to stand with marginalized people, and demand racial and economic justice.
We hope you found this video useful, and hey, if you're an educator who's using our work in your classroom, we'd love to connect with you.